That reframe from moral failure to neurological injury does not come from a textbook, right? It comes from a lived rupture, maybe. And I think you had one. Your whistleblowing experience changed the trajectory of your life. And how did that moment reshape your understanding of courage, truth, and leadership?
I used to be a big believer. I was someone who believed in the law. I believed in education. I believed in leadership. I believed in the police. I really deeply believed in the government's institutions that handle these kinds of crises. And unfortunately for me, I watched an absolute collapse of all of those things. And the only way to navigate it was with pretty extreme courage. Because it's one thing to report to your administrators that you have identified abuse within the institution. But when you figure out, and this took a long time, that the regulator was corrupt and the government was corrupt in how they were handling this, that is a whole other level of trying to figure out a path forward. And for me, ultimately, it led to resignation from the whole system. I just had to walk away. And I know this happens to quite a number of people that I work with who have been put through this kind of bullying and cover up, mill. They do not return to their workplace. I couldn't be paid to work in a school again after watching this whole scenario. So this is where I decided I need to write about this. I need to research this. I need to get the information out there. I've been gifted with a fantastic education. I felt responsible. So yeah, I mean, if it had been abuse of adults, perhaps I wouldn't have felt so strongly. I mean, that's a terrible thing. But this was abuse of children. And for me, we all have our line in the sand. And for me, that's the line in the sand. I would rather go to jail. I'd rather be shot than let child abuse happen on my watch. I can't do it. I just can't do it.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Jen. I feel so respectful to you. And, it seems like you paid a price to learn that lesson firsthand. But most leaders never pay that price, which may be exactly why they don't understand what's really at stake. So, what do you believe leaders most misunderstand about the long-term neurological damage caused by psychological abuse?
I think, Dia, that it is not the fault of leaders. I think that we live in a society that mostly keeps us from knowing brain science. It's not introduced to us. It should start in kindergarten, but it's not. When I do presentations with hundreds of people in the room, I'll say to them, raise your hand if you can name 5 parts of the body and what the part of the body is involved in. All hands go up. Then I say to them, raise your hands if you can tell me 5 regions in the brain, essentially, and what their essential involvement is. And all hands stayed down. There might be one hand, but mostly not. And that tells you right there. How do we expect leaders to understand how physically damaging psychological abuses to the brain? This is not touching the body, and it's doing physical damage to the brain. How can leaders know that when they're not taught it? It should be taught in elementary school, middle school, high school, university, and regularly in the workplace.
Sure thing. Manipulators know exactly which levers to pull, and they are pulling them in plain sight most of the time. And you have said that gaslighters and manipulators often rely on credibility, status, and institutional protection. What does neuroscience reveal about why people fall for manipulative leaders?
Well, what I understood in working on, first having the experience, the traumatic experience, I really believe that lived experience helps a lot to unpack this, because putting the brain science just in an academic sort of package, it makes it harder to understand. But when you've actually been put through it, you've had somebody try and gaslight you, you have a stronger sense of what the science means. And what's really fascinating to me is that our brains, one of the things that they're really weak at, they're not strong at being able to hold 2 contradictory things together. We've seen this discussed in anthropology. We've seen it discussed in philosophy. It's hard for our brains, and neuroscience confirms this. We struggle to understand that the person who's speaking to us is acting normal, is acting compassionate and kind. They're funny, they're intelligent, they're really hardworking. Our brains really struggle to understand that that's a facade. And behind closed doors, whether it's in their home or in a back room or in some kind of an office with a closed door, they are able to do incredibly destructive things. And so when people hear that, they go, I don't really know what that's like. Let me give you some examples, because whenever we give examples, then we can click in that knowledge. Think of Dr. Larry Nassar. Dr. Larry Nassar was the physician for the USA gymnastics team for maybe 30 years. For 30 years, he was reported as being abusive to children, and they never did anything about it, including all the way up to the level of the FBI. They did not wrap their minds around the fact that the good doctor who seemed so caring was also highly abusive. Extremely difficult. I'll give you one more example. Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein was called a god by Meryl Streep. He was believed to be one of the greatest producers of our time. He was charismatic and powerful and talented, and everybody just kind of worshiped the ground he walked on. Well, they knew from early on that he was also highly abusive, but because they could not put these two things together, and there's lots of layers to this. I mean, I'm just giving you a big, very broad view. They didn't hold him accountable. They let him abuse people for 30 years. So, I'm not critiquing Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep would have only seen the godlike side of Harvey Weinstein, because these individuals are highly adept at covering up their abuse. They hide it. So,
well, I'm sure that many people who is watching this show, who went through this abusive pattern, can clearly see that, it is true. And, it's so hard to identify them because, as you said, they have dual personality. Maybe they showcase their best side outside, and anybody who experienced them on the other side can really understand the message that you are providing. The manipulator's brain is doing damage by design, seems like. But what about the person on the receiving end, the employee who has no choice but to absorb it day after day? What happens inside the brain of an employee who is chronically bullied or silenced, and how does that impact organizational performance?
So what happens is essentially, is I describe it as an abuse culture, because you cannot do this type of behavior as a singular act or in a vacuum. It requires a whole construct around you to be able to repeatedly abuse someone. And it's often described, when you read the literature after the fact, it will be described as an open secret. It is well known. It is well established. It's understood, certainly at the leadership level, that the individual that does this behavior is doing it repeatedly. And they might give them a reprimand at first. They might give them a second chance. They might not believe that it was actually accurate. They might fault the employee. They say, oh, the employee is too sensitive. The employee is too emotional. The employee has problems at home. The employee has some kind of a vulnerability. They don't fit in. These are called, in the neuroscience, they're called counterfacts. And when our brain can't understand something, it starts to produce counterfacts. So you make all these excuses for the abusive individual. And the leader has done this, let's say, for a year, maybe 2 years, even longer. And then all of a sudden, the penny drops for the leader. And the leader says, this person is highly abusive. And they, at that point, start to cover up. Why do they cover up? Are they evil people? No. What's happened is they have been groomed, manipulated, and gaslit into thinking that the abuser is the victim of this whole scenario, when in actual fact, they are the perpetrator. So what creates abuse culture? How do these conditions work? You need the abuser, who usually has one or two other people right in their inner circle who abuse as well, or who stand by, watch the abuse, and by not doing anything, they normalize it. So you've got the perpetrators, you've got the abusers, then you have people that slip into fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So the fight people are the ones that report. They go, you know what, so-and-so just abused me, but they're outliers. That's their stress response. And then you've got the flight people. The flight people in the organization look the other way. They never saw the abuse. They didn't notice the abuse. They certainly aren't going to say anything because they don't want the abuse to hone in on them. They will look the other way while it happens to the other employee. That's the flight. Then you get freeze. These people can see what's happening, but they're so terrified. They're so worried it's going to come to their doorstep, or just worried in general, that they can't speak. They don't speak up. They're completely traumatized. They're dissociated. And then you have the fawn. The fawn people are loathsome. None of us like them. But the bottom line is it's a stress response. They lick the boots of the abuser because they're so afraid the abuser is going to turn on them. So they laugh along. They might join in, but they're just these weak counterparts of the real abusers at the center of it all. So you can see, Dia, there's a whole culture that gets built around these individuals. They groom the leader. They manipulate the leader. The leader keeps condoning their abuse. It makes them more empowered. The abuse gets worse. And then when it finally comes to the leader, yes, indeed, these people are highly abusive. Then they have to cover up because they've been negligent. They were informed years ago that this abuse is happening and it's happening on their watch, and they haven't done anything. So you get this kind of endless, really destructive, unhealthy scenario.
Wow. Can you please tell me if one person can go through all that scenarios, like, you mentioned fight responses and different type of responses to an abusive leader. So can one person go through each scenarios in certain situations or different timeline?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. And I would think the answer is yes. We can't control our stress responses. Our stress responses, in the neuroscience, they call it autonomic, which really just means automatic. They happen without you making a conscious decision. You don't say, I'm going to fawn all over this highly abusive person and laugh along and encourage them to do their abuse. You don't make that choice. Your brain and body make the choice for you. So you automatically start to behave in this way. So if someone is assaulting you, you might think in your own mind, if I was ever assaulted, I would fight back. I would never let them, hurt me. But when it actually happens, you might go completely into freeze mode. And then people say to you, why didn't you run away? Why didn't you fight back? And you're like, I don't know. Well, it's because your sympathetic stress response made the decision for you and you can't control it. You can get better at modifying how you respond. Like, this is why mindfulness is such a great practice, because it helps you make more intentional decisions in crisis moments, along with lots of other health benefits. But you can also train people. Like, if I work in an organization, if I work with leadership, I want to see them get trained in how do we avoid this repeat, very, very destructive scenario from happening.